Uh, Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this discussion here. This is Harvesting the Cloud, if anyone's in the wrong room. I hope not. I guess folks will probably be coming in as everyone's finishing up their lunch, but I guess we should get started. My name is Jonah Force-Hill. I work in the U.S. Department of Commerce in the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. That is the principal advisory office of the Department of Commerce for telecom and information technology issues. So this panel, I think, is really an opportunity for us to discuss a range of issues that are of importance to this conference. The future of innovation, of international cooperation on technology issues, cybersecurity, privacy, connectivity. There really are a number of important questions that are raised by the growth of cloud computing to broader internet technology, communications, and security issues. So I think it's really a great topic for this event, and look forward to the conversation. So what I'm going to do is introduce quickly all the panelists here, give a bit of an overview of what we're going to discuss, and then allow each of the panelists to give some quick remarks, and then we'll start a discussion. At the end of the panel, probably for the last 20 minutes, we'll open it up to the audience. If you all have questions or comments you'd like to provide, we'll make sure there's time for that as well. So just first to introduce everyone, starting with the far left is Nikolas. He is a Mercator Fellow of International Affairs at the Mercator Program Center for International Affairs. And as I said, I'll let folks provide a little bit more background on what their current role is and their respective area of expertise. To his right is S. Chandrasekhar, the Group Director of Governmental Affairs and Public Policy at Microsoft India. On my right is Laura Sallstrom. She is the Global Head of Public Policy of Access Partnerships. To his right is Venkatesh Krishnamoorthy, who is the Country Manager for India for the Business Software Alliance. And on the far right is Nikhil Pahwa, who's the founder of Medianama. I don't know if I said that right, but that's it. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about what we hope to achieve here in this panel. We have been asked to discuss what the rise of cloud computing means for a number of policy, regulatory, and other business issues. One of the things that I was asked to do to open this panel is to talk a little bit about what cloud computing is, because I think there tends to be misconceptions about what it is, either overly broad or overly narrow. Actually, the U.S. Department of Commerce, where I work, where it houses the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which really has served as a benchmark defining organization for technology standards and definitions and trends. And NIST defines cloud computing as a model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources, which includes networks, servers, storage, application, and services that can be rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort or service provider interaction. And so there's a lot of different ways that clouds are configured and available to different organizations and to the public. So there are private clouds, which really provide enterprises with back-end applications and services for their specific organization that isn't necessarily available to people outside of the organization. And then there are public clouds, which are available to a broad range of customers or to the public, to citizens of a particular country. And then there are hybrids that allow different levels of access to different types of users. And so cloud computing offers a range of benefits to users, to organizations. You really benefit from the economy of scale. It means that every organization doesn't need to set up its own enterprise IT system. It means that applications can be used by a huge number of users without having to recreate the wheel every time you want to modify or provide a new application or service to a user group. Allows for flexibility. And really, it just allows users to easily tap into applications, to virtual environments, or really more basic computing tools that might be supplied from infrastructures that don't belong or aren't owned by a particular organization or enterprise. And so the kinds of things that are available on the cloud are software as a service, which really is applications of your Google Docs, your Microsoft Outlook. There's platforms as a service, which allows companies to set up their own applications on platforms designed by a third party. And then there's infrastructure as a service, which allows organizations to utilize storage space or processing power of remote computers potentially far away from the home base of the particular organization. So I think when folks think about cloud computing, they often maybe focus on just the software as a service or just the storage capability, but really is all these different options. And having that third-party economy of scale really allows small organizations to utilize big enterprise application services that to have to buy in-house would just be completely unaffordable. So it really is important for governments, for startups, for a range of organizations to be able to have access to those kinds of tools. And you really have seen an enormous growth in cloud computing over the last few years. For example, Forrester has estimated that businesses will spend almost $200 billion on cloud services by 2020 compared to $72 billion in 2014. Gartner, likewise, predicts that worldwide public cloud service market will grow 18% in 2017, up to $246 billion. So these are really, cloud computing is something that people have been talking about for a long time, but continues to be a major driver of internet and computing growth over into the foreseeable future. So I think we're going to, I'll pass it on to my co-panelists here, but I think what we're going to do is try to talk about some of these opportunities for businesses, for users, for governments to utilize the cloud. And then what are some of the challenges, either regulatory, in terms of security concerns, privacy concerns, and other sort of challenges that emerge for governments and for organizations that are beginning to use these services, these third-party applications and infrastructure that may be located out of the jurisdiction in which they operate. And it really introduces a host of challenges, both for regulators, for law enforcement, and for cybersecurity professionals as well. So I think I will turn first to Mr. Chandrasekhar, who can give a bit about himself and talk about some of the opportunities that he sees in cloud computing, both for the public and private sectors.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So the post-lunch session, as they say, is the most difficult. So it is a fight between food for thought and food for the body. So I'm hopeful that the food for thought will win. At least I'll try to make it win. So my background is that I spent about 16, 17 years in the government, in the IT and non-IT sectors, before I moved into the private sector. I worked with some of the bigwigs like TCS, IBM, HCL. I also rolled out some major national level projects like the passport project for the government of India. And for the last 5 years, I've been the group director for Microsoft, looking after technology policy and government affairs. So I'm going to speak about cloud computing and what it means for government and what it means for the government of India. If you look at cloud computing and the challenges of governance, possibly cloud computing is something which is tailor-made for the government. Some of the challenges of governance are, one, there is a long procurement cycle. There has to be complete transparency. A person on the ground cannot experiment with different technologies. They cannot afford to fail. Usually, procurements are one-sided. There is no way of going back. There is no possibility of doing easy pilots. There is no possibility of fail fast, learn, get up, and scale up. So it is start small, uh, scale fast. So all these possibilities are now available thanks to cloud computing. A government official on the ground, if he has an idea, he doesn't have to go through a procurement process which is 1 year long and run so many files. With whatever limited resources he has, he can create a pilot, he can convince his superiors, and then scale up the project to a very large extent. For example, there are many use cases where in the past the government was just not able to act. For example, there was an election a few months back in Tamil Nadu state. Because of widespread allegations of rigging and booth capturing, there was a requirement of video recording the proceeds of the election of 30,000 polling booths. Now, the government had to get this huge amount of storage, 30,000 polling booths for 2 days. At the same time, after 30 days, they did not require this storage. In conventional type of procurement, this kind of application would just not have been possible because it would have been considered wasteful. We also have cases like you have your Kumbh Mela or you have a big rock concert where you have to monitor hundreds of drones and thousands of cameras and so much of IT equipment, but all that is required only for 3 or 4 days. After 3 or 4 days, the entire thing is dismantled. Now, which government can afford to create such a huge infrastructure only for 3 or 4 days? So cloud computing enables hiring of these resources as per the requirement and then giving it up when the requirement is no longer there. As far as software as a service is concerned, today we have the capabilities of huge amount of computing available to every common person. For example, for the state of Andhra Pradesh, we have done a pilot where using the data given by the government, we are able to predict which are the students who are likely to drop out of school. It could be due to alcoholism, it could be due to health problems, but just by seeing the pattern of attendance and the pattern of marks, the big data and the analytics, it enables us to predict, and then the government is able to make interventionist measures to ensure that those students do not leave school. Now, this kind of a service, it costs very, very less. The state government doesn't have to own the supercomputers, doesn't have to develop the software. All they need to do is to give data which is anonymized and then pumped into the cloud and results are given. Excuse me. Now, if cloud computing is such a cure-all and a magic wand for India, why is it that India is lagging behind as far as the adoption of cloud computing is concerned in public services? To the credit of the government of India, I've been working with them from 2012. They have brought in a lot of policy documents and a lot of policy measures, ranging from the Meghraj Cloud Initiative, accreditation of the cloud players, and all that. But where we are getting muddled is twofold. Firstly, there is a gap between technology and policy. Always technology is far ahead of policy, and the degree of wisdom that a country has is how fast the policy can catch up with technology. In the case of India, we have a dichotomy because we are not able to deal with a technology that is not within the confines of our national boundary. So this challenge to the Westphalian concept of the state, that is what causes a lot of conflict. A lot of our policies, like for example, the Public Record Act of 1993, it says that no data can be located anywhere outside India. Then there are voices which say that there should be strict data localization. All data of every form produced in India should remain within India. But they do not realize that if this argument is played too far, the Indian BPO industry would suffer the most. The third problem which the governments face is convergence. Information technology and communication technology have completely converged. So where is the line of where is telecom and where is information technology? That also creates a conflict. The fourth area of conflict is law enforcement access. There are many technologies like voice over internet protocol and the ability of people to download any kind of software and make any kind of communication without the government having a control of it. In the past, in the telecom world, they had absolute control. In the internet world, they do not have control. So these are some of the strains which are preventing the government from going ahead and wholeheartedly adopting the cloud. But I would end my talk by saying that we should not let the tail wag the dog. There are definitely security concerns, but the benefit of cloud computing far outweighs any security concerns. Security concerns can be handled. We need to classify our data. Certain kind of data should probably never be on the computer. Certain kind of data should not leave the room. Certain kind of data should not leave the building. But a vast majority, over 90% of data, is data about garbage bins, about buses, about hospitals, about wards, about beds. So why not the country utilize the power of big data and cloud for the benefit of the people? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think we're going to dig into the data localization question in a moment. But first, maybe we could hear from Nikhil, who's going to provide a bit more of a user perspective on some of the benefits and challenges for end users with cloud computing.
Thanks, Jonas. So I'm going to look at things, I'm going to circle back a bit to the data localization question, but I'm going to take a step back and look at what are the challenges we're facing today and why are we discussing even regulation of the cloud, because effectively it is regulation of the cloud as well. Where we're coming from a user perspective is that in the virtual world, we're used to an era of no boundaries of, let's say, using essentially setting up a service in, let's say, Mexico or in, let's say, in Indonesia, using it here. Most users don't know where the data is stored. They don't know where the service is coming from. And quite often, even from a business perspective, from a startup perspective, they just go where it is most efficient for them and where it is easiest for them. And that's what creates a global competition for a startup's business, for a large company's business, as well as for users to get services that are cheap and effective because input costs go down because of the cloud. But what we're seeing is that there's a friction that's existing currently between the virtual world and the physical world. For an ecosystem that's used to permissionless innovation, no regulation, and having a global market to operate in, we're seeing an increased push for the balkanization of the internet that's been driven by the physical world. Because, if you think about, let's say, Amazon as a country or Facebook as a country, or, that the physical world feels a little threatened by the amount of data that's being collected. And data is at the core of this particular debate. So that's why you hear talks about data localization. What's made things a little tougher and worse is that over the last 10 years, there's been a significant amount of consolidation of power, at least amongst the largest internet companies. And so when some other country, because that company's originated from that country and based there, can get access to your citizens' data, what do you do? So, and that's why you're seeing in India these arguments that keep coming up about data colonization and, asking for regulation of cloud services. And I think one part of it, which is also missed out quite often, is that what do you do as a business, as a startup, when you want to host a service, but you're only restricted to your own country. So that protectionist kind of an approach, what it does is that it might, because of lowered competition, it might not create enough incentive for improvement of services. It might also create a situation where there is a significant amount of pressure for access to that data or that particular service holds within the country. That may not be necessarily legal, and which you know that happens a bit in this country as well. But also what it does is that it might lead to a poor, the quality of service being delivered to become much poorer for consumers. What we need, at least the way I look at it, is this globally competitive space where the idea is to provide the best possible service to a startup and deliver the best possible service to a consumer. Think about it, if, let's say, as a user, if I was restricted to just services from one entity within the country, or let's say 4 entities within the country, it reduces the value that I get effectively if there isn't sufficient competition there. And so, there's a lot of talk about this being from a security perspective, and I'm not downplaying that in any way. And there are legitimate concerns, and we need to move towards ensuring national security by providing access where it's necessary and legal. But I also wonder sometimes about whether this talk about data colonization in this country is also about creating local oligopolies. I think we need to find a way that benefits users and consumers more. But one aspect that I want to keep thinking about from a user's perspective is that when you look at in the physical world, when there's harm done to you, where do you go? You go to your state for help. But what happens when it's in the virtual world? Where do you go? And therefore, largely this debate that's happening here is about jurisdiction issues and who owns the data, and therefore who owns the user, and what are the protections that exist for users from that perspective. So I think increased adoption of the cloud is great. Services become better, more efficient. But the counterpoint is that there is a great danger of increased balkanization, because as more and more users start using services which are hosted on the cloud, nations become a little wary, sometimes legitimately, sometimes not, on how their citizens are being impacted, because their responsibility is actually to the people in that country. Thanks.
Great. So I think now we'll turn to Venki, who maybe will talk a little bit about what some of the companies that he works with are encountering, some of the challenges with the global regulatory environment.
Right. So, I'm Venkatesh. I go by Venki. I am the country manager for the Business Software Alliance. We go by BSA, the Software Alliance. I represent companies from a broad spectrum of companies who work on traditional software, companies who are moving to the cloud. So example of companies could be Apple, Amazon, web services, Intel, Microsoft. So traditionally, companies who were looking at software are now who are moving to cloud services, right? So that's where the challenge is interesting. And specifically, we did this scorecard, and I'm happy to share more details. We did this scorecard in 2016, where India, apart from 24 other countries, we were looking at how we ranked them based on their cloud computing scores. So India ranked somewhere close to 18. I mean, it was 18 out of 24. So there were a lot of parameters by which we did the ranking. But specifically, if you look at all the countries that participated in the survey, right? So we're looking at 3 key parameters that we put it out there to ensure that these rankings are done. Number 1 is, how do these countries look at cross-border data flows through their policies? I mean, it's often been told in this panel itself in a span of 30 minutes or so. So I'm assuming all of you can envisage the importance of cross-border data flows in today's world. So I won't stress more on that. Number 2 is, you look at how is the regulatory environment? Is it predictable, or is it too constraining Because if you look at cloud computing, it's at that stage where a lot of changes are happening. And thanks to Jonah for kind of laying that land of how the cloud environment is. A lot of us seem to think of it as a monolithic entity, but honestly, it's not. So you have the infrastructure service provider. You have on top of it a layer of application that sits, and you have on top of it upcoming trends like machine learning and deep learning working on it. So it's not very easy to hold the cloud service provider and say, hey, what are you doing with this? And so as the economy, as the digital economy evolves, you're looking at how do you regulate different parts of it in a different manner and let it go as much as it can to pursue innovation, right? And finally, you're looking also at protecting the intellectual property of these companies and ensuring that there is a due process by which these companies can protect the rights for them. So these are the global pillars, if you could call it that, by which we rank the companies, but it was much more robust. Each of those 3 pillars will have sub-pillars under it. So coming specifically to India, we hosted a roundtable a month ago, and we kind of got a lot of government stakeholders. The roundtable was specifically to understand how can you support public sector adoption of cloud. So we collated a lot of examples from the government, the very interesting examples on scholarships, interesting examples of how government is using cloud to give citizen management services. So as you see, the potential for this group of technologies, if you could call it that, is phenomenal. And I have examples of global governments, small governments who have made good use of this technology. So the Indian spectrum, the challenges that you're largely seeing, if I could just bucket it under 3 categories, right? So number 1, you're looking at the misconceptions of security. So assume you are a bureaucrat, you're in the state, you have this energy, you want to move things to the cloud. So now you're like, now what? What should I do? You're like, I'm going to start an RFP, I'm going to invite stakeholders to bid for it. At the same time, you're constantly worried. This is government data, like the government data which will sit with a third party. It might not be in the server sitting next door. It might be in Singapore. It might be outside. So they're wondering, what does this mean for me legally? I mean, if something happens to the data, can I be taken to court? If something happens to that data, can I be held responsible 10 years later after my tenure? So bureaucrats and government authorities who really want to solve a lot of these issues are struggling with these questions. And as most of you in this room will know, India is a federal country, right? So we have a government at Delhi, and obviously that's 1 by 30 of everything, right? So there are 29 other states, 7 union territories. They all have governments. They're coming up with different RFPs. So the first point I was trying to make was specifically with respect to the misconceptions on security. What does cloud security mean? Does that mean that data is going out of the network? How am I liable? Is the data portable? Assume I choose a service provider, can I port it to another? So there are a lot of these questions that the government is having, the public sector is having, not just the government, even other entities. And it transposes to the second point I'm trying to make, which is the center-state coordination. MeitY has been doing, the Ministry of Information and Technology, Electronics and Information Technology, it sits in Delhi, has been doing phenomenal work, but there are also state governments who are trying to do their own thing. So is there a way we can bring everyone together and kind of mesh that gridlock sort of which exists between the state and the center? The states have their own initiatives, center is trying to do, everyone is trying to do the job, but we'll have to figure out a way to come together and do it. And the third point which I wanted to also look at was capacity building. Going on to cloud is not a one-stop shop. Like you just say, I'm going to cloud and stop, because it's an investment. 6 months down the line, 9 months down the line, you're continuing, you'll have challenges that you'll have to face. It's called cloud migration, right? What are the challenges that come in cloud migration? So we'll have to look at capacity building across the spectrum, and it's not just with a particular level of official. Say, for example, if there are technical staff handling the servers, if there are technical staff who are guiding you through the migration process, they also need to be trained. So you're seeing 3 challenges from an India perspective, which I would like to broadly lay out, and kind of superimpose that with the 3 other pillars that I mentioned and see like how India fares in this regard as like the challenges roll by. I think that's good.
Great, thanks, Venki. So next we're going to turn to Laura Sallstrom, who's going to talk a little bit about, or try to try to clarify a little bit about how the cloud regulatory environment functions, because each country, each state within a federal system may have its own generalized approach to regulation of cloud data. You may have sector-specific, you may have an omnibus privacy regulation, you may have an omnibus financial services regulation that deals with cloud computing, but for companies that are trying to operate in a global market, making sense of what rules apply when, under what circumstances, has really become a monumental challenge. So Laura, if you want to give us a little bit of your thoughts on that.
This is the button? All right. Okay. Hi, I'm Laura Sallstrom. I will not go into my biography. I think you guys all have it in your reading materials, but I will say a little bit about Access Partnership, because you may wonder why I am speaking today. We are a public policy consultancy that focuses on regulatory issues that impact the technology sector. So we work on technology regulatory issues across the entire spectrum of items potentially affecting the industry. And we do that from a global perspective because we're in the technology sector. We know that anything that affects this industry is global and has to be considered from that vantage point. I think we'll have some interesting conversations today about how that global perspective mashes with territoriality and firm stronghold on legal measures that still have their place within borders. But again, a global industry, and we need to think about it from that perspective. One thing I will reiterate is what my colleagues have said, which is I think we have to be very careful with definitions here. The term cloud computing is something that is bandied about for a number of purposes, and I think to a certain extent the industry has done themselves a little bit of harm in overusing the term cloud computing to describe many types of services and many different ways or types of distributed networking computers. I will focus on one of the terms, public cloud computing, as well, to give you my perspective on that. I think that term is one that is particularly confused because it is used interchangeably between accessible networks that governments provide, meaning public, but it's also a term that is used by companies like Salesforce, for example, to talk about architecture that commingles data and truly is a distributed networking system where they are moving data across borders, literally to its most efficient location. And those distinctions are important because the impact that that regulations have on cloud computing companies vary greatly depending on not only the type of service they provide, but the way that they provide that service. So when my customers come to me, cloud computing customers, and they say, Laura, I want to go into this market. Tell me who are the government officials in this market that I should talk to. Tell me what is the regulation I should pay most attention to? And in every case, I have to say to them, well, what is the particular service that you're offering? What's your particular interest? And also tell me, which of these markets do you really care about? Because it is a mistake to think that the only conversation that you need to have is with the Data Protection Authority. In fact, what we're seeing is that even though we talk about regulating cloud computing now, or we talk about strengthening or tailoring data privacy regulations, there's already quite a lot of regulation and initiative that affects the industry. So data protection, as we talked about, there are a lot of governments around the world that have federal, state level regulations, and those privacy regulations can conflict. Even in the European community where you have a GDPR mechanism, you still find member states with differing levels of interpretation of that. So even in the EU where you think you have a single standard, you might not have the same rule in various markets. And then, of course, there are lawful intercept issues, and different governments have different perspectives about what they should be able to access and when they should be able to access it. And those lawful intercept requirements, unfortunately, do not infrequently conflict with data privacy regulations. Similarly, the variety of cybersecurity regulations and requirements that exist market to market can have an interesting impact on cloud computing providers. For example, if a particular environment requires a standard for cybersecurity or a different type of security, if you are, for example, a public network, then it's not as easy for you to move data from one jurisdiction to another, or you have to layer on a particular type of software and encryption in order to meet the standard in that market. The other thing that is particularly interesting from my perspective, and where we're doing more and more work for customers, is looking at specific industry verticals. So as the industry evolves, we're seeing that there's more regulation within particular sectors. So there may be federal state regulations, but then there are independent regulators who can impose requirements on licenses for their customers. And those licenses then are de facto applied to the cloud provider. Or we can start thinking about this definition of cloud computing more broadly, because really, if you think about it, an organization like Citibank is also itself a cloud computing provider, right? Because they're moving financial information around. So all of those financial services providers, healthcare services, anybody involved in emergency communications infrastructure or government procurement have then a unique set of regulations that they have to adhere to. So an interesting fact for you to start to get your head around just how many regulations this means. In the United States alone, at the federal level, there are 10 different entities that are responsible for financial services regulation. And they all have the right to apply restrictions in their licenses on how data is managed. Then within procurement, I think a couple of my colleagues have mentioned procurement already. Procurement rules vary from level to level of government. They can be at the federal level, the state level, or the city level, wherever it's being procured. And then you also find new rules or varying rules regarding data and technology evolving within individual ministry levels, and then also into RFP levels, which I think you mentioned. And within RFP levels, we sometimes find interesting things in surprising places. So there was what turned out to be just a poorly written RFP in Canada, for example, a few years ago, that required all of the data would have to be managed within Canada. And then after some conversations with the government, it turned out that, well, really that wasn't the case at all. This was not national security related data. That really wasn't a requirement. And then the last thing I will mention with respect to regulation is that if you're a cloud computing provider and you're being proactive and responsive, you're also probably spending a lot of time looking at technical standards related developments in different markets. There are a lot of global organizations that are trying to work on standards in this area, but in addition, it has become a competitive and strategic tool for some governments to use to try to create advantages for themselves in the market. The last thing I will mention to you, which I think is something that we have to consider in the context of this conversation, is that not only are there actual regulations in place, but there also are informal rules or blockers that are preventing adoption of the technology. And we have talked about that a little bit here today, but I think there's a consistency in technology adoption that seems to be magnified with respect to cloud computing, where fear and misunderstanding is really driving a lot of decision-making in this area. And there's a little human element to it too, in that I think it's hard for people to believe that your technology and your data can actually be safer. If it's out there in this mysterious cloud thing, then it certainly must be, if it's right here on my laptop, surely this is safer if it's right here than it is if it's way up there. But that is just not the way that technology works, so that hurdle has to be overcome.
Thank you, Laura. I think that provides a nice segue to our next speaker, Nikolas. I think one of the things that we're seeing increasingly is a overlap between or an intentional or unintentional impact of cybersecurity legislation on the cloud computing environment. I think there is in some respects, overlapping desire to both protect data, but also to make data available to law enforcement officials for investigations and prosecutions. And there is a concern among those groups, some justifiable, some less so, that the cloud computing environment makes accessing that data far more difficult for them. So I think you see both cybersecurity legislation that is intended to shore up security that is causing governments to move away from the cloud, but also a desire to bring data within the access of law enforcement authorities who need that for their own purposes. So Nick's going to talk a little bit about how he sees cybersecurity being impacted by increasing cloud service regulation.
Thanks a lot, Jonah. Thanks for having me this afternoon. My name is Nikolas, and over the last year or so, I've been conducting some research on the role of international legal norms and confidence-building measures to reduce the likelihood of military escalation in cyberspace. And stemming from this research, Hugo Zilberberg and I wrote a paper on internet fragmentation for this conference. So make sure to pick up a copy after you leave this room. And for the next couple of minutes, I'd like to just talk a little bit about this paper and the outcomes. But at the outset, I'd like to highlight that despite the growing concerns over security incidents in cyberspace, the internet still holds significant economic and social opportunities. And I think that's important to highlight when we have a discussion about cybersecurity. However, as we show in our paper, is that some of this securitization process is based on a flawed premise that a fragmented internet with monitored digital borders is more easily defensible, and that pretty much relates to your point, thinking that once you own a certain device or you have physical control over it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually the case in cloud. In fact, fragmented internet actually can slow down or if not even prevent altogether positive effects of cloud services. So these dramatic changes that we're observing are causing many states to be concerned about losing control. And the World Economic Forum published a report last year highlighting 28 issues of current or potential fragmentation in technical, commercial, and governmental spheres. We focused on the governmental sphere to show how states tend to do what they think when they're losing control, and that is restricting actions, regulating procedures, or even prohibiting certain actions. And that leads me to a first conclusion, because as connectivity becomes a crucial factor for economic development, the security development nexus is increasingly recognized as a key sustainability factor. But unfortunately, on the international level, it seems to be really hard to find consensus on agreements how to bring especially the norms discussion forward. And so a lot of states that are more advanced or have the capacity to push this discussion forward are now applying or introducing national laws that have extraterritorial reach or impact how other states are accessing the market or how global cloud computing can be used and operated. As cloud computing is expanding drastically, this tension is not going away. I mean, it seems to highlight that companies and government need to solve this issue together. I mean, we looked at the recent Microsoft lawsuit with the US government over rightful access over data, and this is a hot potato for everybody who's engaging in this, but the potential is really significant. However, states' practice has shown that the restriction of cross-border data flow for privacy or security reasons and increased power to lawfully access this data is becoming more and more widespread. When we look at the EU General Data Protection Regulation that is associated with the Privacy Shield Agreement that creates a framework whereby data flows are restricted towards outside countries where data protection frameworks are too weak, or if we look at the UK Investigatory Powers Act, which requires phone and internet companies in the UK to maintain the capability to intercept their customers' personal data. There's many examples, and it's not just well, these are two cases now from Europe, but they're happening all over. But ultimately, this belief that a more fragmented internet is bringing borders to the digital realm leads to a more secure interstate environment is flawed. And if that happens, we believe for three main reasons. First of all, it's currently much harder to secure a network than to protect it. I'm sure many of you have heard the analogy with a soccer game that, you know, if you played soccer in cyberspace, the result would be 200 and 200 and not 2 against 1 or 1 against 0. I mean, the offensive is really dominating this discourse. And that is a problem, but it doesn't mean that this can't be solved or properly addressed. Unfortunately, currently this leads to a perpetual state of insecurity that can currently only be addressed through diplomatic means such as confidence-building measures and legal agreements. The road is long, and as we heard in the first discussion on an international cybersecurity treaty is potentially an option further down the road in a couple of years, but currently that is not something that we can rely on. The second conclusion that we draw is that tools to circumvent national borders will most likely continue to appear and be used precisely by those actors who present the most security threats. And that's a notion that I think just needs to be taken into consideration when uses or certain tools are restricted, because there's many other ways than just circumventing that. It's a known factor that policy is oftentimes running behind technological advancements, and just by limiting possibilities instead of properly fixing them and incorporating them, it's oftentimes not too helpful. And then thirdly, cyberspace is the domain and not the source of security threats. And as countless government reports have argued across the board, the shortcomings in governments on security in the security realm normally don't come from a lack of institutional capacity to collect data or process them, but from a lack of integration and coordination between law enforcement, the justice system, and the intelligence community. And we can look at examples on the fight on ISIS, how they were recruiting people in cyberspace. Ultimately, it's important to highlight that security measures most often fail to human and not computer error. And so we really need to demystify this discussion by bringing it back to the human component, figure this out by not overcomplicating them by mysterious definitions or unclear notions, but by really understanding how we as individuals or entities are processing this. And for this reason, what we concluded with is that we need to create conditions so that states can reduce the severity of their actions by, for example, developing interoperable policy frameworks, so that, for example, on a regional level, states can engage and really figure out together how their policies are more interoperable, both on an interstate level, but also with the industry, how overlapping regulations can be reduced, how we can figure out that some of the security concerns that are necessary and justified have the smallest negative impact on the internet as a domain of huge potential, both in socioeconomic and social parts. And then lastly, what we're proposing is to figure out how to properly measure this negative impact, to develop a fragmentation impact assessment. So that will be one way of highlighting through different indicators that we're currently actually thinking of as we speak, and this is going to be the next report and the next publication after this piece, how states are helping states to see how very complex domestic national law oftentimes contradicts their own positions in international negotiations or bodies. So really helping them by highlighting how their governmental policies are impacting or further fragmenting cyberspace. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and I yield my time to the floor.
What was that? Somebody talking? All right. Thank you, Nicholas. So we've got about 20 minutes left. So maybe what we can do is just have a quick conversation here, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. So I think this group's done a pretty good job of articulating all of the opportunities of cloud computing for startups, for innovation, for the distribution of government services, and also identified a number of the challenges, whether it's regulatory, whether it's ownership issues, whether it's law enforcement access to data needed for investigations and prosecutions. And I think what would be useful is for us to maybe spend a moment talking about some of the ways forward, because I think everyone's in agreement that the benefits of cloud computing really need to be, really should be maximized, and that the societal impact is really a positive one, but that there are very real challenges that need to be addressed by governments, by industry, and by the end users themselves. So I don't know if anyone wanted to just provide a couple thoughts on sort of ways forward on either one or a suite of issues that we've highlighted here today. Sure.
Yeah, so some of the areas on which we can work, I think, given the realities of the world and given the realities of how critical data is the new oil, and there is a lot of cyber warfare and stuff like that. So a few things we need to work together with nation states and the large corporations. First is data classification, as I said in my talk. So we should not over-engineer the problems of the cloud, and we should not hold the benefits of the cloud as ransom to the issues of security. This can be done if we classify the cloud, classify our data very carefully, and have policies tailor-made to the level of sensitivity of the data. So that in itself will reduce 90% or 95% of the problems of perception and management of policy with respect to data and cloud. The second thing is that the MLAT process needs to be significantly upgraded. So we are now in the internet era, but I am told the MLAT communication still takes place on snail mail and paper and all that. And there are cases where requests from one government take up to 2 years or 3 years for the other government to respond. So in this digital age, when everything is happening so fast, if we don't modify or don't work on the MLAT process, there would be a very big challenge. The third area where we could work is that having treaties and agreements between countries, at least instead of aiming for a global treaty, which will be an ideal thing to do, at least treaties like the one which is being worked on between USA and UK now on data sharing. India is a democracy. We have shared common values with countries like US, UK, etc. If there is a data sharing arrangement, then definitely it will lead to a lot of building of trust. And in the absence of a global treaty, some of these measures can help cloud move forward. Thank you.
All right, if there's no one else who wants to solve all of these problems up here as we can work through them, open it up to the floor.
Okay. Hello. Now, it's very good heartening to listen.
Well, if you could introduce yourself also, please.
Pardon?
If you could introduce yourself.
Oh, well, I'm Professor Rakesh Mehrotra, and it's my second innings. I teach the communication engineering, all IP networks, so end-to-end, in the bits and bytes to the postgraduate students and the engineering students, and also the faculty members in different universities. Prior to that, I was the Chief Corporate Regulatory Officer of Tata Teleservices. So I understand the subject a little bit here and there, not that extent as you. But there are a couple of, it's good that we have started talking about the positives of this thing and how we can do that. But there are a couple of challenges, very important challenges, we cannot overlook it. Because history, that repeats again and again, because I have the historian sitting side by me. Okay, now the thing is that we have to demystify the cloud around the clouds. And until we do that, nothing will move around. Now what he is making Chandrasekhar is making a point, let's classify the data, classification of data. We say, well, this 80%, 90% data is non-sensitive data, go on the cloud. Well, the problem comes from where? Problem comes from the innovators, particularly John. Now it comes from the Department of States. They started inventing the IP and they wanted to make it global because all the business was going towards America. Where is cross-subsidizing, if I say, in the Indian term, I must say. Cross-subsidizing American economy at the cost of the rest of the world. That happened. Good. They wanted to keep it open. Now the question is that local capacities are building up, but again at the same time, what happened yesterday in the Las Vegas, or what happened in the 9/11. All those things were there, where they passed on the Patriot Law, and the Patriot Law says, perhaps the Microsoft everybody has to take care of, it says very clearly any data of any American company lying anywhere in the world on any server, it is transmitted to Department of Commerce and Internal Security of US. Means you are putting, Microsoft is coming, Hughes is coming, anybody is coming with the data. His data is transmitted, whether they are using or are not using it. The second thing is that it came to the project PRISM. I'm not required to elaborate the things, everybody knows about it. It was basically a data breach. And it came in the public domain. Now the public is quite susceptible about the things, about what has happened, where I'm going to put my data over there. Whereas these particular things which are coming over, we have to take care of those things. I'm putting my data. Now what's happening at Microsoft, Google's, everybody, they are taking the data free from the customer. You won't believe it. I can give you the exercise to do that. The moment you sign on your Android phone or any iOS phone, it asks you very clearly that you are abiding by terms and conditions. And there is an advertising ID. The moment you move anywhere in the market, anywhere, the entire data, everything of mobile phone is there somewhere else. And they do the advertising based on that. And saying, well, you can disable it. That's good. Now the data security is a prime importance of things. Now, I say, well, if the data is with the government is going to manipulate the data. But if data is sitting in the China, US, and the Pakistan, what's going to happen around? So we have to find out the ways so that we can start using these things in a much bigger way. So those are another thing is that there is no geographical boundaries. If some crime is happening through Seychelles or any country, stealing my data, stealing my bank account and all those things using on the cloud, I don't have any way out. Which jurisdiction I'm going to go to. So these are some of the critical issues which I just wanted to highlight. Perhaps very good chances of the growth of this particular thing. Let's do that. And the last thing is that everything is offered to Indians on the platter. But there is a need of the local capacity building also.
All right.
And the local capacity building only will be done once you force upon Indians to use the Indian things.
Thank you. Over here. If we can try to also...
I'm Dr. Sangwan. One gentleman said that we have to have faith in, for the security of the data. There is only a lip service. We cannot depend on any government in the world. And I'll give you a simple example, particularly agriculture and trade. We scientists ask data of this year from the government. They will not give it for research. But the same data is available with the US Department of Agriculture. They bring that data with them. When we ask them how you got this, our data, Indian data, we don't have it. So we don't know. We don't know. There is a system called agricultural commodity outlook. India never had it. Some countries, they have it. Last time I wrote to the DG ICR, we should have it. That entire trade dependent on that data. Complete American and European, particularly American ships are already standing in the sea, loaded with the food grains. With this data, they know which country, how much grain they'll need, and what is the price. This is the currency data what you are talking. Because you are private people, private company, you are a party to it, to this mafia. So you cannot say you want to rob the nation, you want to rob the public. So how we can trust you? Do any of you have an answer? Thank you.
Yeah, what was the question? What is? I don't think any of us know what the question was. It's okay. So yeah, it'd be great if you could have a concise, clear question. That would be helpful. Thank you.
I'm KS Park from Korea. Mr. Chandrasekhar, just a minor point. You mentioned one point where policy is not catching up with or conflicting with technology is convergence, where telcos and internet companies converge. The way I see, the sectors are not converging. It's just that there are internet companies that are amassing network access through cache server network, things like that. So I don't see any convergence between the internet companies or between platforms and telcos. So just wanted some clarification on that. And also you mentioned, it's interesting, what you said about MLAT was interesting because you said MLAT needs to be upgraded instead of saying MLAT needs to be replaced by a certain other procedure, because you are sitting by you are sitting beside a representative of U.S. government, the moderator, who and the U.S. government is currently working out with the UK a process that bypasses MLAT. So I was wondering what your whether you have any position on it, and whether you chose the word upgrade for a purpose.
Your first point is that of convergence. I was talking from the Indian context. Today, we have in India a Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, and you have a Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. These two are quite different. If you look at the words, it is Telecom Regulatory Authority. That itself shows that there is somebody with a regulatory mindset and somebody who is an authority. So looking at, giving you examples of convergence, you yourself know that what used to be the normal voice communication over telecom network has now largely migrated to an internet protocol and VoIP. And what could be easily intercepted and what could be easily managed over a telecom network is now becoming more difficult to manage over an IP network. And the end product of these two technologies is the voice that you hear, but when you hear the voice, you cannot make out that whether it is the wire behind it or whether it is an IP technology behind it. So in that context, there is convergence. But definitely, there is a little friction between the internet services providers and the traditional telecommunication companies that you were alluding to. But the way the world is moving to is that a lot of the internet companies will get transformed into telcos, and many of the telcos will get transformed into internet companies. For example, you take the Indian telecom companies, they have a huge number of services which they offer on top of their infrastructure. You have the Indian telecom company called Airtel, which has a VoIP voice chat, which is known as Hike. At the same time, you have Google, which has a voice service, or a Microsoft, which has a voice service, or a Microsoft, which has a PABX service on the cloud. So definitely there is going to be convergence, and we will not be able to avoid it. As far as MLAT is concerned, I am conscious of the fact that I belong to the private sector. I'm no longer in the government. So I cannot replace anything which is existing in the government. I can only urge the government to modify the MLAT, but not replace it, because it is a structure which has existed for very long. Replacement would become very contentious to even discuss. So we can only urge them to make it a little faster.
Just one follow-up question, if it's okay. The process you described is really a vertical integration, not technological convergence. And I think a vertical integration, I think it should be guarded with with competition regulation. But if you focus too much on convergence and try to come up with a mixed or one regulation for both the platforms and the telcos, I think it can really paralyze how the internet works, and it can add a lot of fuel to this this call for OTT regulation and all of that. So.
Great. Well, I think we've run out of time here, but let me thank all of my co-panelists. Oh, maybe.
So the ministers are here. We need to change that. I will give Nikhil the last word on the panel, and then we can end.
So just to the point about vertical integration, I think there are strong net neutrality regulations in India that are preventing any kind of disproportionate advantage to telecom operators over, distorting the access to services on the internet. I just wanted to reiterate the point that Shankar had made about data classification. I think that is the most important discussion that we have to have, because what that does is that it allows different types of data to be treated differently, what kind of data you want to leave, allowed to leave national boundaries or not, even whether you want to still have jurisdiction over it after it leaves national boundaries because it's originating from here. I think these are discussions that we also ought to have, what is sensitive data, what is not sensitive data, what is moderately sensitive data, etc. Just quick comments, thanks.
All right, well, a call to action for everyone who can categorize different data into these, I'm sure, easy to manage forms. But thank you, everyone, and thanks to my panelists here.